On the morning of my 75th birthday, my grandson delivered the cruelest gift I could imagine. Blake, the boy I had helped raise after his mother's accident, looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Grandma, it's time you moved into Whispering Pines Retirement Home. You can't manage this big house anymore, and I need the money from selling it." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't argue. I didn't weep. I simply smiled, nodded, and let him believe he'd won. Little did he know that 3 months earlier, I had already transferred the Victorian home his grandfather and I had lovingly restored to the Historic Preservation Trust. The deed was gone, and so was any claim he thought he had to my life's greatest treasure. I never imagined spending my 75th birthday this way. I'd woken up early, eager to prepare a special breakfast, my famous blueberry pancakes with fresh cream, a tradition that stretched back to when Blake was just a little boy with cowlicks and missing front teeth. The dining room table was already set with my grandmother's porcelain, polished silverware placed precisely beside cream linen napkins. I'd even cut fresh roses from the garden, arranging them in the crystal vase Blake had given me for Christmas years ago. Everything was ready, waiting for my grandson to arrive. We hadn't spent much time together lately. Blake had been busy with work, always his excuse for the increasingly infrequent visits over the past 2 years. But today was different. He'd promised to come for breakfast, insisted on it actually, mentioning he had something important to discuss, something special for my birthday. I remember when Blake was small, how he'd sneak into my garden early on my birthday, picking wildflowers with his chubby hands. "Happy birthday, Grandma," he'd whisper, eyes sparkling with childish delight as he presented his mismatched bouquet. I couldn't recall the last time he'd called me Grandma instead of Georgia, his recent habit of using my first name a small rebellion I never commented on, but quietly disliked. The antique wall clock in the hallway showed 9:30 when I heard his car pull into the driveway. I smoothed my dress, a soft blue one I'd chosen specifically because Blake once said it matched my eyes, and waited for the doorbell. Instead, I heard a key in the lock. I'd given him that key for emergencies, not casual entries, but I pushed, the thought aside. Today was for celebration, not criticism. "Grandma, you here?" His voice echoed through the foyer, professional and detached. "In the kitchen, dear," I called back, pouring fresh coffee into the waiting cups. Blake appeared in the doorway, tall and handsome in his tailored suit, so like his grandfather it sometimes took my breath away. No warm smile creased his face today, though. His expression was serious, almost clinical, as he surveyed the breakfast spread. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble," he said, not sitting down. "It's no trouble. It's tradition." I gestured to the chair opposite mine. "Coffee's hot." He remained standing, checking his watch. "Actually, I can't stay long. I have a meeting at 11. "On Saturday?" I couldn't keep the disappointment from my voice. "The real estate market doesn't take weekends off." Blake pulled an envelope from his inner jacket pocket and placed it on the table. "This is what I wanted to discuss with you." I didn't reach for it. Something about his posture, stiff, almost rehearsed, sent a warning through me. "What is it?" "Information about Whispering Pines. It's that new retirement community off Maple Road. Very exclusive, excellent care options." He spoke rapidly, the practiced pitch of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "I've already put down a deposit to hold a place for you." The pancakes grew cold between us as I stared at my grandson. "A retirement home? That's your birthday surprise?" Blake had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable before his professional mask slipped back into place. "It's not a surprise. It's a solution. This house is too much for you to handle alone. You're 75, Grandma. What if you fell on those steep stairs? What if there was a fire? I've managed just fine for the 15 years since your grandfather passed, I replied evenly. He sighed, impatience flickering across his features. Look, I've run the numbers. This place is worth at least $950,000 in today's market, even more if we update the kitchen before listing. That's more than enough to cover a premium suite at Whispering Pines for years, with plenty left over. Left over for what? I asked quietly, though I already knew the answer. Blake shifted his weight, avoiding my eyes. For family, for the future, for your great-grandchildren someday? I nearly laughed. Blake wasn't even dating anyone seriously as far as I knew. And in the meantime? In the meantime, I could use some capital for my business expansion. The downtown office space I've been eyeing just came on the market. It would be an investment, really. Your money working for the family's future. And what about my garden? My neighbors? The life I've built here? I gestured to the kitchen around us. The heart of the home where I'd taught Blake to bake cookies, where his grandfather and I had danced on rainy evenings, where generations of our family had gathered for holidays. Blake reached for the brochure, flipping it open to show glossy photos of landscaped grounds. Whispering Pines has community gardens, and they organize social activities. You'll make friends your own age. My own age, I repeated softly. Because at 75, I couldn't possibly have meaningful relationships with people younger than me. He missed the irony completely. Exactly. You'll be much happier there. The house is just a burden at this point. I looked at my grandson, truly looked at him, and saw not the boy I'd loved, but a stranger calculating the value of my life in square footage and market trends. When had this happened? When had the child who once brought me wildflowers transformed into this cold-eyed realtor, seeing only commission potential in the home his grandfather had lovingly restored, beam by beam? This house is my life's work, Blake. Your grandfather. And I saved it from demolition. We stripped a century of paint from these banisters by hand. We uncovered the original hardwood under 3 layers of linoleum. And it's a beautiful house, he conceded smoothly. Which is exactly why it deserves owners who can properly maintain it. Young owners. A family, perhaps. The implication stung, worse than any direct insult. I was too old, too feeble, too irrelevant to deserve the home I'd poured my heart into. And my grandson, the boy who had once helped me plant the rose bushes that still flourished in the garden, was the one delivering this message, on my birthday no less. I pushed back my chair and stood, keeping my spine straight despite the heaviness settling in my chest. I think you should leave now, Blake. Grandma, be reasonable. Georgia, I corrected him quietly. If you're going to treat me like a business transaction, you might as well use my name. My Victorian house on Magnolia Street hadn't always been the showpiece it was now. When Earl and I purchased it 48 years ago, it was condemned, scheduled for demolition. A dilapidated eyesore with broken windows, rotting floorboards, and a partially collapsed roof. Most people thought we were crazy. You're buying a teardown, our friends warned. But where others saw decay, Earl and I saw possibility. We were young then, just married, with more dreams than dollars. Earl taught history at the local high school. I worked as a librarian at the university. We'd been saving for a starter home, but the moment we saw the old Montgomery house with its ornate gingerbread trim and wrap-around porch, even in its decrepit state, we knew we'd found something special. Think of the stories these walls could tell, Earl had whispered, running his hand across the peeling wallpaper in what would later become our living room. That's who my husband was, a man who valued history, who believed in preserving the past while building toward the future. The bank reluctantly gave us a mortgage after Earl presented a meticulous restoration plan. Weekends, evenings, summer breaks, every spare moment went into bringing that house back to life. We taught ourselves to replaster walls, refinish hardwood floors, rewire electrical systems. When professionals were needed, we'd save for months. eating beans and rice until we could afford the slate roof repairs or the foundational work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our daughter Virginia arrived a few years into the restoration. I can still picture her toddling through half-finished rooms, helping Earl sand banisters with her tiny, ineffectual hands. As she grew, she became truly helpful, learning alongside us the value of patience and craftsmanship. By the time she was in high school, Virginia could identify architectural periods at a glance and restore window frames with professional precision. "This house is more than wood and glass," Earl would tell her. "It's a living history, a testament to craftsmanship worth preserving." Virginia would nod solemnly, absorbing her father's reverence for preservation. But as she entered adulthood, her interests shifted. She married young, too young, I thought, to a handsome but restless man named Judd Williams, whose ambitions always seemed to involve quick returns rather than lasting value. They moved frequently, chasing Judd's ever-changing business schemes across 3 states. Blake was born when Virginia was barely 22. I still remember the first time I held him, tiny, red-faced, with a shock of dark hair just like Earl's. "He'll be the one," Earl whispered as we stood over the hospital bassinet. "The one who'll love this house like we do someday." For a while, it seemed Earl might be right. During Blake's early years, Virginia and Judd's marriage became increasingly strained, and they'd often leave Blake with us for weekends, sometimes weeks. Those were precious times. Earl teaching Blake to identify different wood grains, me showing him how to nurture the heritage roses in the garden. Blake absorbed everything with his grandfather's same quiet intensity. When Virginia and Judd finally divorced, Virginia moved back home with 7-year-old Blake while she attended nursing school. Those 3 years were filled with simple joys: homework at the kitchen table, Sunday dinners in the formal dining room, Blake's laughter echoing through hallways that had witnessed generations of family moments. After Virginia completed her degree, she and Blake moved to an apartment closer to the hospital where she'd accepted a position. They still visited regularly, and Blake spent every summer with us, helping Earl with restoration projects and learning the history of every nook and cranny of the old house. Everything changed when Virginia's car slid off an icy bridge one January night as she drove home from a late hospital shift. Blake was 16, suddenly motherless, and Judd, who had remarried and started a new family in Colorado, showed little interest in taking in his teenage son. "He'll live with us," Earl said simply after the funeral. "This is his home, too." Blake moved into the blue bedroom overlooking the garden, the same room his mother had grown up in. At first, grief made him withdrawn, but gradually, the rhythms of life in the old house seemed to heal something in him. He joined Earl in the workshop, refinishing furniture and repairing vintage fixtures. He helped me catalog the history of the neighborhood for the Heritage Society. He seemed to find comfort in the solid permanence of a house that had weathered its own storms over more than a century. When Blake left for college, a business degree, not history as Earl had hoped, we converted Virginia's old room into a study. For him, filling bookshelves with volumes we thought might interest him, hanging his childhood artwork alongside vintage maps of the city. "Always a place for you here," Earl told him during his increasingly infrequent visits home. Earl's health began to deteriorate during Blake's junior year, heart problems that eventually required a triple bypass. The surgery was successful but left my husband noticeably frailer. Blake graduated with honors, but Earl was too weak to attend the ceremony. "Tell him I'm proud," he whispered as I left for the airport. "Tell him the house will be waiting." Those were nearly the last words Earl spoke to me. He passed peacefully in his sleep 2 days after Blake's graduation. One moment, I was half of Earl and Georgia. The next, I was just Georgia, alone in the big house that had been our life's project. Blake came home for the funeral, of course. He stood tall and stoic beside me at the cemetery, his arm firm around my shoulders. For a few weeks afterward, he stayed in his old room, helping me sort through Earl's things, accompanying me to meetings with attorneys and financial advisors as we settled the estate. "Grandpa wanted you to have this," I told him one evening, handing him Earl's pocket watch, a Hamilton that had belonged to Earl's own grandfather. "He was so proud of you." Blake held the timepiece reverently, tracing its worn edges. "I'll miss his stories," he said quietly. No one could bring history to life like Grandpa. It was the most emotion he'd shown since the funeral, and it gave me hope that despite his business degree and growing interest in real estate, something of Earl's values had taken root in our grandson. When Blake announced he'd accepted a position with a prestigious real estate firm in the city, just 30 minutes away, I was secretly relieved. Close enough to visit regularly, but with his own life and career. The perfect balance. For the first few years, it worked beautifully. Sunday dinners became our tradition. Blake would arrive with fresh bread from the artisanal bakery downtown and stories of his work week. I would prepare Earl's recipes, pot roast or chicken and dumplings, and share news of the neighborhood and my volunteer work with the Historical Society. I never expected those warm Sunday evenings to fade away. Never imagined the grandson who had helped tend Earl's vegetable garden would someday look at our family home and see only dollar signs. Never thought I'd hear him call the craftsmanship we'd spent decades restoring outdated features that might challenge the modern buyer. But time changes people in ways you can't anticipate. Success, especially early success, can transform perspective more thoroughly than failure. And Blake was very successful indeed. Looking back, I can pinpoint when things began to change between Blake and me, though the shift was so gradual I nearly missed it. 3 years after Earl's passing, Blake arrived for Sunday dinner driving a sleek German car that must have cost more than Earl had earned in 2 years of teaching. He parked it prominently in the driveway, rather than along the curb, positioning it almost like a showpiece. "Impressive car," I remarked as he entered, noticing the designer watch on his wrist that had replaced his grandfather's Hamilton. "Made partner at the firm," he replied with a grin, "youngest in company history." I embraced him warmly. "Earl would have been so proud of your hard work." Something flickered across Blake's face, an expression I couldn't quite identify. "Grandfather would have appreciated the achievement," he agreed, though his tone suggested Earl might not have understood the significance in today's world. That evening, Blake spent more time on his phone than in conversation, apologizing with practiced charm about urgent client matters. When he did engage, his comments about the house carried subtle criticisms disguised as concern. "These old windows must cost a fortune to heat in winter," he observed, running his hand along the wavy glass panes Earl had so lovingly restored. "They're actually quite efficient with the storm windows your grandfather installed," I replied. "And the craftsmanship is irreplaceable." Blake nodded absently. Still, modern energy-efficient windows would probably pay for themselves within 5 years. It was the first indication that Blake was seeing the house through different eyes, evaluating rather than appreciating, calculating rather than cherishing. The Sunday dinners became less frequent after Blake's promotion. "Market's hot," he'd text last minute, showing properties all weekend. Sometimes weeks would pass without a visit, though he occasionally called with quick, distracted check-ins that felt more obligatory than genuine. When he did visit, his conversation increasingly turned to the neighborhood's appreciation potential, and how similar Victorian homes had sold for stunning amounts with the right updates. He began bringing renovation magazines featuring sleek, modern interiors that bore no resemblance to the historic charm Earl and I had worked so hard to preserve. "Just ideas," he'd say casually when I frowned at photos of historic homes gutted to create open-concept spaces. "These vintage properties are selling at premium prices with the right modernization." The subtle pressure increased after Blake opened his own boutique real estate firm specializing in luxury heritage properties for modern living. His firm's brochure featured historic homes that had been stripped of their original character, their warm wood tones replaced with cool grays and whites, their unique architectural details sacrificed for minimalist aesthetics. Your house could be a showcase property, he suggested one afternoon, walking through the rooms with an appraiser's eye rather than a grandson's fondness. With strategic updates, of course. I changed the subject, but Blake was persistent in ways both small and significant. He began sending handymen to help with maintenance without asking. Strangers arriving on my doorstep announcing they'd been hired to clean the gutters or service the boiler. When I called to thank him but explain I already had regular service, people I trusted, he brushed aside my concerns. "You shouldn't be managing these details at your age," he said dismissively. "I'm just taking things off your plate." My age. He mentioned it with increasing frequency, as if my 70-plus years had somehow diminished my competence rather than enhanced my experience. Every small incident, a forgotten grocery item, a misplaced book, became evidence in his building case that I needed supervision. Things escalated the winter I slipped on an icy patch of sidewalk while collecting the mail, resulting in a sprained wrist. Blake arrived at the emergency room in full crisis management mode, speaking to the doctor over my head as if I weren't present. "Has she had cognitive testing recently?" he asked the young physician. "My grandmother lives alone in a very large old house with lots of stairs." "Your grandmother is right here," I interrupted firmly, "with a perfectly functioning brain and a minor wrist injury." The doctor, to his credit, directed his questions to me afterward. But Blake's message was clear. He viewed me as increasingly incapable. The following week, Blake arrived with a real estate colleague he introduced as just a friend, who happened to specialize in senior transitions. This woman wandered through my home making notes on a tablet, while Blake distracted me with questions about Earl's old photographs. When I confronted him afterward, he claimed she was simply admiring the historic details. I didn't believe him, but I maintained my composure. Earl had always said that losing your temper meant losing your advantage. The pressure tactics continued. Property tax statements mysteriously began arriving opened, though I'd never given Blake permission to check my mail. Brochures for retirement communities appeared on my coffee table after his visits. He scheduled a routine appointment with a financial advisor who spent the entire meeting suggesting I simplify my estate by liquidating my assets, particularly the house. Most concerning was Blake's growing interest in the practical details of my property ownership. He began asking pointed questions about the deed, about Earl's will, about whether I had considered updating my estate planning. Each inquiry came wrapped in concern, but I recognized the calculating interest beneath. I caught him in my home office one afternoon, going through the filing cabinet where Earl and I kept important documents. He claimed to be looking for a family photograph, but the drawer held only legal papers and financial records. That evening, after Blake left, I stood in the center of my kitchen, the kitchen where I'd taught him to make his grandfather's famous cornbread, where we'd decorated Christmas cookies together through his childhood, where Earl and I had danced on quiet evenings to music on the old radio. And I felt something shift inside me. A quiet resolve formed, a determination that this house, this legacy of love and craftsmanship, would not become just another property in Blake's portfolio. The next morning, I called Loretta Montgomery, my oldest friend and a retired attorney, who had helped Earl and me with legal matters for decades. Over tea in her sunroom, I confided my concerns. "I'm not imagining this, am I?" I asked after explaining the pattern of Blake's behavior. Loretta removed her reading glasses and fixed me with a steady gaze. "No, Georgia, you're not. I've seen this before. Adult children, or grandchildren, who begin to view an elderly relative's assets as pre-inheritance rather than the property of a living, competent person. What do? I can't bear the thought of Blake pressuring me out of my home, but I don't want to damage our relationship beyond repair." Loretta's smile was gentle but determined. "Who says those are your only options? Earl didn't raise you to think inside such limited parameters. She was right, of course. Earl had always approached problems creatively, looking for solutions that honored both practical needs and deeper values. "Tell me about the Historical Preservation Trust you and Earl always supported," Loretta said, reaching for her legal pad. "I believe we might find a path forward that protects both your home and your heart." 3 days after my conversation with Loretta, I received a call from River Jackson, the executive director of the Historic Preservation Trust. River had worked closely with Earl and me over the years, particularly on the campaign to designate our neighborhood as a historic district, protecting it from developers eager to replace century-old homes with modern condominiums. "Georgia, I was delighted to hear from Loretta about your interest in our Legacy Properties program," he said, his deep voice warm with genuine enthusiasm. "Your home has always been a shining example of thoughtful historic restoration." "Earl would have wanted this," I replied, watching from my front window as a young family strolled by, the children pointing at the ornate weather vane Earl had salvaged from a demolished church. He always said preservation wasn't just about buildings, it was about keeping history alive for future generations. River arrived the following afternoon with a portfolio of documents and a professional photographer. Over tea in the parlor, using Earl's grandmother's delicate porcelain cups, we discussed the details of the Legacy Properties program. "Essentially, you would transfer ownership of the house to the trust," River explained, while retaining lifetime tenancy rights. "The trust guarantees the property will never be demolished or significantly altered from its historic character." "And after I'm gone?" I asked, though Loretta had already outlined the arrangement. "The house becomes a permanent part of our preserved properties collection. Depending on your wishes, it could become a museum, educational space, or continue as a private residence with strict preservation covenants." He smiled. "Based on the exceptional documentation you and Earl maintained of the restoration, this property has significant educational value." I nodded, remembering the meticulous journals, photographs, and material samples Earl had organized throughout our decades of work. These weren't just renovation records, but a chronicle of our marriage, our shared passion, our life together. "There are tax advantages, of course," River continued, "and the trust establishes an endowment for ongoing maintenance drawn from our general preservation fund. You'd never need to worry about major repairs or upkeep costs again." For the next 2 hours, we walked through every room of the house, River marveling at details even I had forgotten: the hand-carved rosettes at the corners of the door frames, the original gasolier we'd converted to electricity while preserving its Victorian charm, the kitchen's soapstone sink that had served the house since 1887. "This is exactly the kind of property our legacy program was designed to protect," River said, as the photographer captured images of the inlaid parquet floor in the entryway. Many historic homes are being gutted for open-concept renovations or torn down for new construction. What you and Earl accomplished here deserves to be protected in perpetuity." By the time River left, I felt lighter than I had in months. The decision wasn't just about thwarting Blake's plans, though I couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in that aspect. It was about honoring Earl's memory, about ensuring that 48 years of patient restoration wouldn't be erased by granite, countertops, and subway tile. The paperwork took nearly 2 months to complete. Loretta reviewed every document, making small adjustments to ensure my interests were fully protected. I designated a modest portion of my savings to establish a maintenance fund specific to my property, supplementing the trust's general resources. River connected me with a young couple who maintained several trust properties, who would handle the heavier aspects of home maintenance going forward. On a crisp autumn morning, I signed the final documents in Loretta's office. The deed transfer was official, though nothing visibly changed. I returned to the same house, set about my usual routines, but with the profound peace of knowing that the home Earl and I had poured our hearts into would remain a testament to craftsmanship and care long after I was gone. I didn't tell Blake. Not out of malice or secrecy, but because the timing never seemed right. Our relationship had grown increasingly strained, his visits rarer and briefer, focused primarily on pointed questions about home maintenance issues that he inevitably characterized as concerning. I was waiting for the right moment, hoping for a Sunday when he might stay long enough for a real conversation, when we might reconnect as family rather than as property owner and interested realtor. That moment never came. Instead, matters came to a head unexpectedly, 3 months after the deed transfer, on the morning of my 75th birthday. After Blake left, after his cold assessment of my capacity to live independently, after his presumptuous plans for my home and my life, I sat alone at my dining table amid the breakfast I'd prepared with such hopeful anticipation. The pancakes had gone cold, the coffee bitter in its neglect. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of disappointment. Not just about this birthday, but about the gradual erosion of the relationship with the boy who had once looked at me with such love and admiration. When had Blake's eyes changed to see me only as an obstacle to his ambitions? When had his grandfather's lessons about heritage and stewardship been replaced by calculations of market value and investment potential? I cleared the table slowly, wrapping the untouched pancakes and placing them in the refrigerator. Old habits of thrift die hard, even in moments of emotional turmoil. As I washed the dishes, Earl's mother's china, which had survived 2 worlds wars and the Great Depression, I made a decision. I would not confront Blake immediately. I would let events unfold naturally, allowing him to reveal the full extent of his intentions before disclosing mine. Earl had always said that patience revealed truth more effectively than confrontation. True to my expectation, Blake called the very next day, his tone artificially bright. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he began without preamble. "I know the idea of moving was a shock, but I've scheduled a tour of Whispering Pines for next Thursday. Just to look. Their gardens are really impressive. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised." "That's very thoughtful," I replied neutrally. "What time should I be ready?" My apparent compliance seemed to encourage him. Over the next week, Blake called daily with new details about Whispering Pines, the gourmet dining options, the cultural outings, the on-site medical staff. He never once asked how I felt about leaving my home of nearly 5 decades. Never inquired about what possessions I might want to take with me, or what arrangements I might prefer for the items I'd need to leave behind. The most revealing conversation came 3 days before our scheduled tour, when Blake called to discuss the financial logistics. "I've been running the numbers," he said, his tone sliding into what I recognized as his professional sales voice. "If we list the house next month, we can capitalize on the spring market. My staging team can have it ready within 2 weeks of you moving out." "I see," I said quietly. "And the proceeds?" "Well, after covering your accommodation at Whispering Pines, we'll need to set aside a portion for long-term care insurance. The rest would be managed as investments to supplement your expenses." "Managed by whom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "By me, of course," Blake replied with a hint of impatience. "I handle these matters for several elderly clients. It's part of my firm's comprehensive service." "I'm family, not a client," I reminded him gently. There was a slight pause before he responded, his tone softening artificially. "Of course, Grandma. That's why I'm handling everything personally. I want what's best for you." "What's best for me?" I thought as I ended the call. "Not what I want, not what I've chosen, but what he has decided is best for me. And, coincidentally, most profitable for him." That night, I called Loretta and River. It was time to prepare for the confrontation I could no longer avoid. Thursday. Morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of pristine spring day that showcased my garden at its finest. The heritage roses Earl and I had cultivated over decades were beginning their first bloom, their fragrance drifting through open windows. From my bedroom, I could see the copper beech we'd planted on our 10th anniversary, now a towering sentinel, at the corner of the property. I dressed with particular care for the upcoming confrontation. A deep plum dress Earl had always admired, my grandmother's pearl earrings, sensible but elegant shoes. Dignity is armor, Earl used to say during difficult school board meetings or contentious historical preservation battles. Today, I would need every ounce of the dignity we'd shared. Blake arrived precisely at 10 a.m., driving a different luxury car than I'd seen previously, newer, more ostentatious. He entered without knocking, calling out with forced cheerfulness. "Ready for our tour, Grandma? The admissions director is expecting us at 11. I was waiting in the parlor, seated in Earl's favorite chair beside the fireplace where generations of our family had gathered on winter evenings. On the mahogany side table lay a leather portfolio Loretta had prepared, alongside a pot of Earl's special occasion tea in my grandmother's silver service. "We should talk before we go," I said calmly, gesturing to the chair opposite mine. Blake checked his watch with poorly disguised impatience. "We don't want to be late. We can chat on the drive." "This conversation needs to happen here, in this house," I insisted gently. "Please sit." Something in my tone must have registered because Blake reluctantly settled into the chair, though he perched on its edge like someone prepared for immediate departure. "Tea?" I offered, already pouring a cup. "Grandma, we really don't have time." "Make time," I interrupted, my voice quiet but firm. "You've been in quite a rush to move me out of my home. Surely you can spare 15 minutes to hear what I have to say about it." Blake accepted the teacup with visible reluctance. "I know change is difficult at your age," he began, falling into what I recognized as his practiced client management tone. "But I'm only thinking of your safety and comfort." I took a deliberate sip of tea, allowing the moment to stretch into uncomfortable silence before responding. "Tell me, Blake, when did you first start thinking of this house as yours?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, at what point did you begin calculating its market value against your business needs? When did my home become your potential asset?" A flush crept up his neck. "That's not fair. I'm concerned about you living alone in a high-maintenance property at your age." "My age," I repeated thoughtfully. "I'm 75, Blake. Not incapacitated. I still serve on 3 community boards, maintain this garden that your grandfather and I created, and host monthly meetings of the Historical Society. Yet you speak as if I'm one step away from complete dependency. Statistics show that falls are the leading cause of injury for people over 70, he countered defensively. This house has 3 staircases, original plumbing, and electrical systems that your grandfather meticulously updated to exceed modern safety codes, I finished for him. The plumbing and wiring in this house are in better condition than many new constructions, as any honest inspector would confirm. Blake set down his teacup with a sharp click against the saucer. "Look, I've put down a non-refundable deposit at Whispering Pines. I've already spoken with my stager about preparing the house for market. Why are you fighting this when it's clearly the sensible solution?" There it was. The crux of the matter laid bare without pretense. He had made decisions about my home, my life, without consultation, without consent, without respect for my autonomy. "When your mother died," I said softly, "and your father showed no interest in raising a teenage boy who welcomed you without hesitation." Blake's expression tightened. "That's not relevant to when you needed college tuition beyond what your mother's insurance provided, who liquidated stocks to ensure you graduated debt-free. I appreciate everything you and grandfather did for me," he said stiffly. "But that's not. And when you started your real estate business, who provided the seed capital that your bank denied?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I paid that back." "With interest." "Yes, you did," I acknowledged. "Because Earl and I raised you to honor your obligations. But somewhere along the way, you seem to have forgotten the most important lesson we tried to teach you." "Which was what?" he asked, an edge of defensiveness sharpening his words. That a house is not merely a financial asset. It's a vessel for memory, for history, for the intangible inheritance that can't be quantified on a balance sheet. I leaned forward slightly. Your grandfather and I didn't pour 48 years into restoring this home, so it could be gutted for an open concept. Floor plan and granite countertops, Blake's expression hardened. The market demands certain features. This house, as it stands, is a museum piece. Beautiful but impractical by modern standards. Exactly, I said quietly. A museum piece, something to be preserved, not commodified. What are you saying? I reached for the leather portfolio on the side table and removed a document bearing the embossed seal of the Historic Preservation Trust. I handed it to Blake without comment. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowing in confusion, then shock as understanding dawned. A deed transfer? You gave away the house? When? How could you— 3 months ago, I answered calmly. I transferred ownership to the Historic Preservation Trust under their Legacy Properties program. I retain lifetime tenancy rights, but the house is now legally protected from significant alteration or demolition. Forever. Blake stood abruptly, the document clutched in his hand. This can't be legal. You can't just— I should have been consulted. This property was meant to stay in the family. The family, I repeated softly. Blake, in the past year, you've visited this house exactly 7 times, always with some agenda related to its maintenance issues or needed updates. You haven't asked about my life, my activities, my wishes. You haven't shared a meal that wasn't interrupted by business calls. You haven't once mentioned your grandfather or the legacy he hoped to pass on to you. Not his property, but his values. You did this to spite me, he accused, his voice rising. To punish me for suggesting a practical solution to an obvious problem. I shook my head slowly. No, Blake. I did this to honor your grandfather, to ensure that what we built together wouldn't be dismantled for profit the moment I'm gone. I met his gaze steadily. And yes, I did it to reclaim my autonomy from a grandson who stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an obstacle to his ambitions. Blake paced the room, running calculations behind his eyes, looking for angles, loopholes, leverage, all the skills that had made him successful in business but had eroded his capacity for genuine connection. The deposit at Whispering Pines, he muttered. The staging company I've already contracted. The investors I've spoken to about the property's potential. He turned to me accusingly. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've made a choice, I replied simply. As is my right. As has always been my right. Without consulting me. Without considering how this affects my plans. Your plans for my home? I clarified gently. A home you have no legal claim to, despite the assumptions you've been operating under. He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years, not as a convenient elderly relative to be managed, but as a woman of agency and determination. The same woman who had, alongside his grandfather, tackled a condemned Victorian, when everyone else saw only an expensive liability. In that moment of recognition, I glimpsed a flicker of the boy he had once been, the sensitive child who had helped Earl carefully strip paint from ornate woodwork, who had practiced patience and precision under his grandfather's guidance. But that flicker quickly faded, replaced by the cold calculation of the man he had become. This discussion isn't over, he said finally, his tone clipped. I'll be speaking with my attorney. You're welcome to do so, I replied, rising from my chair with deliberate steadiness. Loretta Montgomery handled all the legal aspects of the transfer. You remember Loretta, she used to bring you peppermint sticks when you helped at her garden parties. I believe her office still has the same telephone number. Blake grabbed his car keys from his pocket. I should have expected something like this. You've always been stubborn beyond reason. Not stubborn, I corrected him. Resolute. There's a difference that your grandfather understood perfectly. He moved toward the door, then paused. What about Whispering Pines? The deposit is non-refundable. I smiled slightly. Perhaps you should consider it an expensive lesson in the danger of making assumptions about other people's property. The door closed behind him with a force just short of a slam. Through the parlor window, I watched him storm to his car, speaking furiously into his phone as he drove away. I remained standing in the center of the room Earl and I had painstakingly restored, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only a profound sense of having honored the life we'd built together and the principles that had guided us through nearly half a century of marriage. In the days following Blake's abrupt departure, I moved through my house with renewed purpose. Each room seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were bearing witness to my reclamation of space and self. I spent one entire afternoon in Earl's study, which remained largely as he had left it. His collection of architectural history books lining custom shelves, the drafting table where he'd created detailed drawings of original moldings and fixtures. We wanted to recreate the comfortable leather chair that still held a slight impression of his form. On the second morning, I called River Jackson at the Historic Preservation Trust to update him on the situation. Blake didn't take the news well, I explained, watching cardinals flit through the copper beech outside the kitchen window. We anticipated as much, River replied, his calm voice reassuring. Loretta and I have already documented the confrontation. In our files, just in case. The transfer is ironclad, Georgia. You did everything properly. It's not legal challenges I'm worried about, I admitted. It's the damage to what little relationship we had left. River was quiet for a moment before responding. Sometimes preservation requires difficult choices. Earl understood that better than most. He was right, of course. Earl had fought countless battles against developers, city planners, and even neighbors who failed to understand the value of what they were so quick to discard. History isn't just in museums, he would say. It's in the craftsmanship of everyday spaces, in the materials and methods that connect us to those who came before. After hanging up, I found myself drawn to the sun-dappled garden where Earl and I had spent countless hours nurturing heritage plants that had nearly disappeared from modern landscapes. The climbing roses he'd propagated from cuttings taken from his grandmother's farm were beginning their spring display, their fragrance a living memory of his gentle hands tying canes to the trellis he'd built to match an 1890s design. Standing among those blooms, I made a series of decisions that felt less like new choices and more like acknowledgments of truths I'd long known but hadn't fully articulated. First, I would not chase after Blake or attempt to justify my actions further. The door remained open for reconciliation, but I would not cross his threshold bearing apologies for exercising my right to determine my own future. Second, I would embrace my role as the current steward of this historic home with renewed dedication. The trust's involvement didn't diminish my responsibility. It extended it, creating a bridge between my stewardship and the guardianship of future generations. Third, I would expand my work with the Historical Society's education programs, particularly those focused on teaching traditional restoration skills to young people. Earl had always believed that knowledge not passed on was knowledge lost forever. And finally, I would complete the memoir Earl and I had started years ago, Saving History, one banister at a time, documenting not just the technical aspects of our restoration work, but the philosophy behind it. The manuscript sat half-finished, in his desk drawer, waiting for the conclusion I now felt ready to write. That evening, I called Lucille Barrett, who had been my closest friend since we taught together at the university library decades ago. Unlike many of my peers who found my dedication to the old house charming but excessive, Lucille had always understood what drove Earl and me to pour ourselves into preservation. Blake showed his true colors then? She asked after I recounted the confrontation. I think he showed the colors he's been trained to see the world in, I replied, feeling a sudden sadness for the transformation that had taken place in the boy we'd raised. everything reduced to market value and investment potential. And how are you holding up? Lucille's concern was palpable even through the phone line. Surprisingly well, I answered truthfully. There's a certain clarity that comes with having your worst fears confirmed. No more wondering if I'm misjudging his intentions or being unfair in my assessment. What will you do now? I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Live, Lucille. Fully and intentionally in the home Earl and I created together, and ensure that what we built outlasts both of us. The following morning brought practical matters into focus. I contacted a home security company to update the system Earl had installed years ago. I changed the locks, providing new keys only to Lucille and to the young couple from the trust who would assist with maintenance. I reviewed my broader estate plan with Loretta, making adjustments to reflect my evolving priorities. Blake is still in your will, Loretta noted as we finalized the documents. Are you certain about that? I nodded firmly. The financial bequest remains. He is still Virginia's son, still Earl's grandson. But the personal items, the family heirlooms, those will go to people who value them for what they are, not what they might sell for. Among those items was Earl's collection of the original hardware we'd salvaged during renovation. Doorknobs, hinges, window latches, each piece carefully preserved and documented. These would go to the Architectural Salvage Museum where Earl had volunteered after retirement. His research materials and restoration journals would join the university's special collections, accessible to future preservationists and historians. As for my garden, I arranged for cuttings and divisions of the heritage plants to be shared with the Botanical Gardens Historic Species Program, ensuring that even the living history Earl and I had nurtured would continue beyond my tenure. 1 week after Blake's visit, I received a formal letter from an attorney I didn't recognize, representing the interests of Blake Williams. The carefully worded document suggested that my sudden decision regarding family property might indicate diminished capacity and recommended independent cognitive assessment. I passed the letter to Loretta, who responded with a scathing legal rebuke that included statements from my physician, the university president for whom I still consulted on special collections, and 3 community organization directors attesting to my mental acuity and active civic engagement. He's grasping at straws, Loretta assured me over lunch in her garden the following week. The cognitive impairment angle is a common tactic when adult children don't get their way with elderly parents' assets. It rarely succeeds without actual evidence, which is non-existent in your case. It's not the legal threat that hurts, I admitted, pushing my salad around the plate. It's that Blake would rather declare me incompetent than accept my right to make my own decisions. Loretta reached across the table to cover my hand with hers. I know, Georgia, but remember what Earl always said about preservation battles. I smiled faintly. It's never really about the building, I quoted. It's about who gets to decide what has value. Exactly, Loretta nodded. This isn't about the house anymore. It's about Blake's inability to recognize your autonomy as separate from his interests. That evening, as spring twilight softened, the edges of my garden, I sat on the porch swing Earl had built from salvaged lumber from the original summer kitchen we'd had to demolish due to irreparable damage. The gentle creak of its chains formed a rhythm that had accompanied countless conversations, quiet readings, and comfortable silences throughout our marriage. In that peaceful moment, I felt Earl's presence not as a ghost, but as a continuation. His values alive in the home we'd created, his vision sustained through the choices I was making now. The conflict with Blake brought pain, yes, but also a crystalline certainty that I was honoring what truly mattered. My 75th year would not be defined by capitulation or compromise of core principles. Instead, it would mark a new chapter of purposeful living, of stewardship both of this historic home and of the values Earl and I had shared. If Blake eventually found his way back to those values, the door would remain open. If not, I had made peace with that possibility as well. The decision to transfer the house had been practical in one sense, a legal maneuver to protect a historic property, but it represented something far more profound, a declaration that my life remained my own to direct, my values my own to uphold, regardless of external pressures or others' expectations. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the gables of my beloved home, I felt not the diminishment Blake seemed to expect of a woman my age, but an expanding sense of purpose. The path ahead was clear, illuminated not just by what I was protecting, but by what I was affirming, the right to define my own legacy, to determine what constituted value in the life Earl and I had built together. 2 weeks passed without word from Blake. The certified letter from his attorney remained the last formal communication, though Loretta had effectively silenced that particular avenue of attack. I maintained my routines, tending the garden in the cool morning hours, volunteering at the Historical Society archives on Tuesdays and Thursdays, hosting my monthly book club in the front parlor where the afternoon light created the perfect atmosphere for literary discussion. On the surface, life continued unchanged. Yet beneath that appearance of normalcy, subtle shifts were occurring, both in my home and in my perspective. I noticed, for instance, how much more deeply I appreciated my daily rituals now that I had reaffirmed my right to them. The simple act of brewing Earl's favorite breakfast blend in the vintage copper kettle he'd restored held renewed significance. Each morning, I found myself pausing to really see the objects that surrounded me, the handcrafted stair newel Earl had carved. To match fragments of the original, the wavy glass window panes that distorted the garden view in exactly the same way they had for generations of previous residents, the worn spot on the third stair tread marking the passage of countless footsteps over more than a century. These weren't just architectural features. They were embodiments of continuity, of care, of the principle that some things deserve preservation precisely because they connect us to something larger than our immediate desires. It was this renewed appreciation that prompted me to invite River Jackson for a more thorough documentation of the house. "We should create a complete record," I explained as he set up professional recording equipment in the front hallway. "Not just photographs and measurements, but the stories behind. Each restoration choice Earl and I made. For 3 days, we moved methodically through every room, with me narrating the challenges, discoveries, and decisions that had shaped our decades-long project. River recorded everything, my description of finding original wallpaper fragments behind a bathroom medicine cabinet, which allowed us to recreate the pattern. The summer Earl spent researching historically accurate exterior paint colors. The celebration when we discovered intact parquet flooring beneath 3 layers of linoleum in the dining room. "This is extraordinary documentation," River commented, as we concluded the attic tour, where Earl had meticulously labeled and stored original trim pieces and extra tiles for future repairs. "Most historic homes have gaps in their provenance, but yours will have a complete narrative from the moment you and Earl began your stewardship." "It's what he would have wanted," I replied simply. "Knowledge preserved is history protected." Following Sunday, what would have been our regular dinner with Blake, brought an unexpected delivery. A large manila envelope from Whispering Pines Retirement Community, addressed to me but with Blake's business card paperclipped to the corner. Inside was a glossy promotional brochure, an application form marked Priority Waiting List, and a handwritten note on Blake's company stationery. "The deposit isn't refundable, but they've agreed to hold your place for 60 days. Reconsider. B." I placed the envelope and its contents in Earl's old leather portfolio, now designated for what I had begun to think of as the Blake situation. Not discarded, but set aside. Acknowledged but not permitted to dictate my emotional state. On Monday morning, as I was deadheading roses in the front garden, a luxury SUV slowed to a stop at my curb. A well-dressed couple emerged, the woman clutching what I recognized as one of Blake's company brochures. They hesitated at the gate, clearly surprised. to see me. "Can I help you?" I called pleasantly, setting my garden shears on the stone bench. The woman glanced at her companion before responding. "We're the Richardsons. We had an appointment to view the property with Blake Williams?" Understanding dawned immediately. Despite the deed transfer, despite my explicit refusal, Blake was still attempting to market my home. "I'm Georgia Hammond," I replied, approaching the gate. "This property is not for sale. It's part of the Historic Preservation Trust's legacy properties program and cannot be sold or significantly altered." The man frowned, checking his phone. "That's not what Mr. Williams told us. He said the elderly owner was moving to assisted living and the house would be available by summer, pending family negotiations." A cool anger settled in my chest, different from the hurt I'd felt during our confrontation. This wasn't just Blake pressuring me. This was Blake actively misrepresenting the legal status of my home to potential buyers. "Mr. Williams is mistaken," I said firmly. "I am the elderly owner, and I have transferred the deed to the Historic Preservation Trust while retaining lifetime tenancy rights. The house cannot be sold by Mr. Williams or anyone else, nor can it be significantly modified from its historic character. If you're interested in historic homes, I'd be happy to connect you with legitimate listings through the trust." The couple apologized for the intrusion and departed, leaving me standing in my garden with the realization that Blake's determination to claim what he viewed as his inheritance had crossed from pressure to potential fraud. I called Loretta immediately. Within the hour, she had drafted a cease and desist letter to Blake's real estate firm, copying the state licensing board and the local realtors association. Misrepresenting the availability of a property for financial gain constitutes both ethical violations and potentially criminal misrepresentation, she wrote in her precise legal language. By Wednesday, 2 more couples had appeared at my door, each bearing Blake's materials. Each told the same story about an elderly relative transitioning to assisted living. Each left with the truth and contact information for legitimate historic property specialists. On Thursday afternoon, my doorbell rang during my usual reading time. I opened it to find Blake himself on my porch, his expression a carefully controlled mask of professional pleasantness belied by the tension visible in his jaw. "We need to talk," he said without greeting, moving to step past me into the foyer. I remained in the doorway, blocking his entry. "I believe all communication should go through Loretta at this point, given your attorney's letter suggesting I'm cognitively impaired and your attempts to market a house you don't own." The professional mask slipped slightly. "You've made your point, Grandma. Very clever, transferring the house to the trust. But there are still options we can explore." "There are no options, Blake," I replied evenly. "The deed transfer is complete and legally binding. My decision is final. Nothing is final until—" He stopped himself, recalibrating. "Look, I've spoken with the trust. There are provisions for amending agreements under certain circumstances. If we work together, present a united front about your care needs." I studied my grandson, the boy I had loved and raised, now a man I hardly recognized, still calculating angles and leverage even as his schemes unraveled. "The trust has a strict mission to preserve historic properties," I said quietly. "They don't amend agreements based on relatives' financial interests. And I've documented my continued independence and capacity extensively, specifically to protect against the kind of claims you're attempting to make." Frustration flashed across his features. "You're being unreasonable. This house is worth nearly $1 million, and you've just given it away. That was family money, family history." "Yes, family history," I agreed. "Which is precisely why I ensured it would be preserved rather than gutted for an open concept renovation and flipped for profit." Blake's composure cracked. Further, "You think I don't care about this house? I grew up here." "You grew up here," I acknowledged. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing a home and started seeing a commodity. Your grandfather and I didn't spend our lives restoring this place so you could exploit it as a vintage property opportunity, as your marketing materials described it. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, momentarily disheveling it. For a flicker of an instant, he looked younger, more like the boy who had helped Earl install reproduction Victorian doorknobs, carefully polishing each brass surface until it gleamed. "What am I supposed to tell my investors?" he muttered, almost to himself. "The truth," I suggested, "that you made promises about property you didn't own and now have to face the consequences." Blake straightened, his professional demeanor reasserting itself like armor. "This isn't over. There are other approaches we can take." "Yes," I agreed sadly. "There are. You could accept my decision and work to rebuild our relationship. You could reconnect with the values your grandfather tried to instill in you. Or you could continue down this path of manipulation and legal maneuvering, further damaging what little trust remains between us." He offered no response, merely turned and walked stiffly back to his car. As he drove away, I realized that the confrontation had left me feeling not victorious, but profoundly sad for what had been lost. Not just the grandson I thought I knew, but his connection to the deeper legacy Earl had hoped to pass on. That evening, I sat in Earl's study, surrounded by the books and papers that had guided our restoration journey. On his desk sat the journal where he had documented not just measurements and materials, but reflections on the meaning of our work. "Preservation isn't just about buildings," he had written. "It's about values made visible. When we restore rather than replace, repair rather than discard, we affirm that patience, craftsmanship, and continuity matter more than convenience or fashion." In the quiet of that room, I finally allowed myself to weep. Not for the conflict with Blake or the stress of these weeks, but for the realization that in saving the house, I might have lost the chance to save something equally precious. The connection between generations, the transmission of values that constituted Earl's true legacy. Yet even in that moment of grief, I felt a certainty that I had made the only choice I could live with. The path forward would not be easy, but it would be authentic to the principles Earl and I had built our life upon. 1 month after my confrontation with Blake on the porch, life had settled into new patterns that felt both familiar and subtly transformed. The house remained unchanged physically, but my relationship with it had deepened. Now I was not just its occupant, but its designated steward, the keeper of its stories until they could be passed to more permanent guardians. This new role brought unexpected developments. River Jackson from the Historic Preservation Trust asked if I would consider allowing small guided educational tours once a month. "Your house represents one of the most meticulously documented restorations in our portfolio," he explained during our meeting in Earl's study. "Architecture students and preservation specialists could learn so much from seeing the techniques you and Earl employed. The idea of strangers moving through my private spaces initially gave me pause, but I found myself warming to the concept as River outlined the educational approach. No more than 8 people at a time, all with specific interest in historic preservation rather than casual tourists. You could be present or not, as you prefer. Earl would have loved teaching others about what we learned," I said, running my hand along the walnut desk he had rescued from a demolished hotel downtown. He always said knowledge not shared was knowledge wasted. And so, on the 3rd Saturday in May, I welcomed my first group of visitors, graduate students from the university's Architectural Preservation Program, their professor, and 2 members of the State Historical Commission. Their genuine interest and informed questions transformed what could have been an intrusion into a vibrant exchange that left me energized rather than depleted. "The consistency of your documentation is remarkable," the professor commented as we concluded in the garden. The before and after photographs, material samples, decision logs, this level of detail is invaluable for teaching restoration ethics as well as techniques. One young woman, who had been particularly attentive throughout the tour, approached me as the group prepared to leave. "Mrs. Hammond, would it be possible? That is, I'm focusing my thesis on residential architectural preservation, and your home is exactly the case study I've been searching for." Her name was Sophia, and her passionate commitment to preservation principles reminded me so much of Earl that I found myself inviting her to return the following week for a more comprehensive examination of our documentation. This spontaneous decision, opening my home and Earl's meticulous records to a student who truly valued them, marked the beginning of an unexpected new chapter. Sophia's weekly visits became a highlight I looked forward to. Her questions were thoughtful, her appreciation genuine, and her dedication to understanding not just the technical aspects of our restoration, but the philosophy behind it resonated deeply with me. She took careful notes as I explained how Earl had recreated missing sections of crown molding, tracked down period-appropriate fixtures, and developed techniques for restoring plaster medallions without destroying their delicate details. "My classmates think I'm obsessed," she admitted one afternoon as we reviewed Earl's hand-drawn plans for the kitchen restoration. "They're all focused on sustainable modern design or adaptive reuse of industrial spaces. They don't understand why anyone would invest so much in preserving these outdated residential techniques." I smiled, hearing echoes of conversations Earl and I had weathered during decades when historic preservation was often dismissed as mere nostalgia. "It's not about freezing the past in amber," I told her, repeating Earl's favorite explanation. "It's about honoring craftsmanship that was meant to last, about recognizing that some things deserve to be maintained rather than discarded." Through these conversations with Sophia and the monthly tour groups, I found myself articulating preservation principles more clearly than ever before, distilling decades of experience into insights that might guide a new generation. Earl's voice seemed present in these moments, his passionate belief in stewardship finding new expression through my words. This emerging role as mentor and educator was not the only change reshaping my daily life. The practical support arranged through the trust proved transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. The young couple who now handled maintenance tasks, Michael and Amber Wilson, brought not just their technical skills, but a genuine appreciation for the house, and increasingly, for me. "Mrs. Hammond, we found these behind the garden shed while clearing ivy," Michael said one morning, carefully unwrapping a newspaper bundle to reveal 3 antique glass doorknobs with brass fixtures. "They look like they might match the ones in the upstairs hallway." His careful handling of these artifacts, his understanding of their potential significance, spoke volumes about the values the trust had instilled in their staff. Over the weeks, what began as a professional arrangement evolved into something warmer. Amber started bringing extra portions of her grandmother's recipes when she knew I'd be working in the garden all day. Michael found and repaired Earl's old hand tools, arranging them in the workshop exactly as Earl had kept them. "My grandfather was a carpenter," he explained when I commented on his careful attention to Earl's organization system. "He always said the right tool in the right place was half the job done right." I began to see these young people not as employees of the trust, but as part of an extended community of care, for the house, for its history, and increasingly, for me. The isolation I had feared after the break with Blake was gradually replaced by connections with people who shared Earl's and my values, who recognized worth in precisely the things Blake had dismissed as outdated or impractical. Loretta, with her characteristic directness, pointed this out during one of our regular lunch dates at her home. "You know what's happening, don't you?" she asked, pouring iced tea from a crystal pitcher that had belonged to her mother. "You're building a chosen family to replace the biological one that disappointed you." "That seems a bit dramatic," I protested mildly. Loretta raised an eyebrow. "Is it? You've got Sophia looking at you like you're the preservation goddess she's always wanted to study with. The Wilsons treat you like the grandmother who appreciates their work ethic instead of questioning their career choices. Even River has started, bringing his research questions to you rather than just checking in on the property." I considered her assessment. "They value what I value. Is it so surprising we've found common ground? Not surprising at all, Loretta replied, but important to acknowledge. Blake's rejection hurt you deeply, Georgia. It's healing to find that your life's work, the principles you and Earl lived by, resonates with others even if not with your own grandson. She was right, of course. These new relationships didn't replace Blake or erase the pain of his betrayal, but they affirmed that the values Earl and I had dedicated our lives to could find fertile ground in unexpected places. This new chapter brought practical challenges as well. Though I remained physically capable of managing most daily tasks, I recognized the wisdom in accepting certain kinds of assistance. The trust's support made it possible to maintain my independence while acknowledging the realities of aging in a historic home. I hired a weekly cleaning service to handle the heavier housekeeping that had become increasingly difficult. I reorganized my spaces to reduce the need for navigating stairs multiple times each day. I accepted Lucille's standing offer to drive us both to evening events rather than driving myself after dark. These concessions to practicality didn't feel like surrender, but like sensible stewardship of my energy, my safety, and ultimately, my ability to remain in the home I loved. It was what Earl would have called strategic adaptation, his term for the thoughtful modifications we had made to the house over the years to ensure its functionality without compromising its historic integrity. As spring yielded to early summer, I realized that the conflict with Blake had catalyzed not just practical changes, but a profound psychological shift. For years after Earl's death, I had inhabited our home somewhat passively, maintaining what we had built together, but not actively extending that work. Now I found myself energized by new purpose, not just preserving our past achievements, but actively sharing their meaning and methods with others who would carry them forward. One particularly warm June evening, I sat on the porch swing watching fireflies emerge in the gathering twilight. From inside drifted the sounds of Sophia and Michael deep in discussion about proper techniques for repairing the original slate roof, a project the trust was planning for late summer. Their voices, eager and respectful, blended with the creaking of the swing chains and the distant church bells marking the hour. In that peaceful moment, I felt Earl's absence acutely, yet also his continuing presence in the values now finding new expression through unexpected channels. The house we had saved was now, in its way, saving me, providing not just shelter but purpose, not just memories, but new connections. Blake's absence remained a wound that hadn't healed, a conversation abandoned rather than resolved. But I was learning that life's most important continuities sometimes skip generations or flow through chosen rather than biological connections. The legacy Earl and I had built was finding its future, not through the grandson we had raised, but through the community of like-minded souls drawn to what we had valued and preserved. July arrived with a punishing heat wave that tested both the house's vintage systems and my own resilience. The central air conditioning Earl had discreetly integrated into the historic ductwork struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures as outside thermometers climbed past 95 degrees for 6 consecutive days. The compressor's showing its age, Michael explained after examining the unit. It's working harder than it should, but we can nurse it through this summer with some adjustments. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping iced tea while Michael outlined temporary solutions and potential replacement options the trust might consider for next year. The conversation felt refreshingly straightforward, practical problem-solving without hidden agendas or manipulative undertones. The Trust's Preservation Committee will need to approve any major system replacements, Michael continued, but Rivers already mentioned prioritizing your comfort while maintaining historic integrity. Earl would appreciate that balance, I noted. He always said preservation wasn't about suffering for history's sake. As Michael gathered his tools, he hesitated before asking, "Has your grandson been in touch at all, Mrs. Hammond?" The question caught me off guard. "No," I admitted. "Not since our confrontation on the porch last month. Why do you ask?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. I saw him parked down the street yesterday when I was clearing the gutters. He was just sitting there, watching the house for maybe 20 minutes before driving away. The information settled uneasily. Was Blake monitoring the property, looking for evidence of neglect to build some new case against my capacity? Or was it something else? Perhaps a reluctant recognition of what he had lost through his own actions. That evening, as I moved through my bedtime routine, I found myself pausing before family photographs I normally passed without much thought. Blake's graduation portrait, his arm around my shoulder, Earl beaming with pride beside us. Blake at 12, carefully holding a salvaged Victorian doorknob he had just finished polishing under Earl's supervision. Blake as a solemn child at Virginia's funeral, clutching my hand like a lifeline. Where had that boy gone? When had calculation replaced connection in his approach to family? I had been asking these questions for weeks without finding satisfactory answers. Perhaps there were none to be found. Or perhaps I had been looking in the wrong direction. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was deadheading roses in the front garden when a sleek silver car parked at the curb. For a moment, I thought Blake had finally returned to continue our conversation. Instead, a woman emerged, professionally, dressed, carrying a leather portfolio similar to the one Blake often used. "Mrs. Hammond?" she called, approaching the garden gate. "I'm Vanessa Wright, Blake's business partner at Prestige Properties." I set down my garden shears, brushing soil from my hands before extending one in greeting. "Ms. Wright, what brings—" "You here?" She glanced at the house before meeting my gaze directly. "I wanted to apologize personally for our firm's misrepresentation of your property. I was unaware of the situation until we received the cease and desist letter." Her directness was unexpected but welcome. "I appreciate that," I replied, gesturing toward the porch chairs. "Would you care for some iced tea? It's already getting warm this morning." Over tea in the dappled shade of the porch, Vanessa spoke candidly about the situation. "Blake has always been ambitious, but his behavior regarding your home crossed professional and ethical lines. The potential complaints to the licensing board could damage our entire firm." "That wasn't my intention," I said. "My concern was specifically with Blake's actions, not your company's." She nodded. "I understand. But I wanted you to know that we've implemented changes to prevent similar situations. Blake has agreed to a 30-day leave of absence for professional development and ethics training. This formal, corporate response to what I viewed as a deeply personal betrayal struck me as simultaneously appropriate and entirely insufficient. Blake needed more than ethics training. He needed a fundamental reassessment of values. But that wasn't something any business partner or professional organization could provide. "May I ask you something, Mrs. Hammond?" Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "Blake has always presented himself as someone who appreciated historic properties. Our firm specializes in heritage homes because of his supposed expertise. But the way he approached your situation suggests something quite different. He did appreciate this house once," I replied carefully. "As a child, he absorbed his grandfather's teachings about craftsmanship and preservation. But somewhere along the way, market value became more important than intrinsic worth." Vanessa considered. "I've noticed changes in him over the past year. An increasing focus on luxury flips, less interest in authentic restoration. He's been pursuing investors for a development project that would require significant capital." This new information illuminated Blake's desperate attempts to claim my home as a cash influx, rather than a preservation opportunity. The knowledge didn't excuse his behavior, but provided context I had been missing. After Vanessa left, I found myself sitting alone, on the porch, watching summer light filter through the stained glass transom Earl had salvaged from a church demolition decades ago. The colored patterns dancing across the wooden floor seemed a fitting metaphor for how new information could transform one's perspective, creating unexpected beauty from different angles. This insight into Blake's financial motivations didn't heal the breach between us, but it shifted my understanding from pure betrayal to something more complex. A grandson caught between inherited values and modern pressures, making poor choices in response to mounting financial stress. August arrived with relentless heat and unexpected developments. The monthly educational tour had grown from 8 participants to a waiting list requiring 2 separate sessions. Sophia had completed the first draft of her thesis, incorporating extensive documentation from Earl's archives and my oral history. The trust had approved the slate roof restoration, with work scheduled to begin after Labor Day. Amid this productive rhythm, Blake's continued absence loomed as an unresolved discord. I hadn't seen or heard from him since Vanessa's visit revealed his financial motivations, though Michael occasionally reported spotting his car in the neighborhood. Then, on a stormy Tuesday afternoon, as thunder rolled across a darkening sky, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Blake standing on the porch, soaked from the sudden cloudburst, looking nothing like the polished real estate broker who had tried to claim my home months earlier. His hair was unstyled, his face unshaven, his clothing casual, rather than professional. Most striking was his expression. Uncertainty rather than calculation, vulnerability instead of confidence. "May I come in?" he asked, water dripping from his shoulders onto the porch boards. I should have called first, but I was afraid you'd say no. I stepped aside silently, allowing him entry into the foyer where he had once played as a child, learning to slide in stocking feet across the polished hardwood. He stood awkwardly, water pooling beneath him, looking around as if seeing the entrance hall for the first time. "Let me get you a towel," I said, disappearing briefly to the linen closet. When I returned, he was studying the family photographs arranged on the hallway table, the same ones I had contemplated after learning he'd been watching the house. He accepted the towel with murmured thanks, drying his face and hair before speaking. "Gan. I lost the downtown development deal," he said finally. "The investors pulled out when the market shifted." I waited, sensing there was more. "The firm is struggling. Vanessa and I might have to downsize, maybe even merge with another company." He ran a hand through his damp hair. "Everything I've been building for the past 5 years is falling apart." I gestured toward the parlor. "Let's sit down, Blake. You're shivering." The formal parlor had always been Earl's favorite room for important conversations. Its proportions, the quality of light from the bay windows, the comfortable chairs arranged for actual dialogue rather than television viewing, all created a space conducive to meaningful exchange. Blake sank into one of the wingback chairs, looking exhausted. I noticed dark circles under his eyes, a tightness in his features I hadn't seen before. "Why are you here?" I asked directly, taking the chair opposite him. He stared at his hands for a long moment. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "Maybe to explain. Maybe to understand. I don't know anymore." "Understand what?" His eyes met mine, briefly unguarded. "Why the house matters so much to you that you'd give it away rather than let me sell." The question, genuine rather than accusatory, created an opening I hadn't expected. "It's not just a house, Blake. It's a testament to principles your grandfather and I believed in deeply. Craftsmanship, stewardship. The idea that some things deserve preservation not because they're valuable on the market, but because they represent human care and connection across generations." He nodded slowly. "I used to understand that. When Grandpa was alive, I really thought I got it." "What changed?" I asked quietly. Blake's laugh was hollow. "Success, ironically. I started making real money in real estate, specializing in historic properties because that's what I knew from growing up here. But gradually, I started seeing these houses differently, as commodities with specific value points that could be maximized with strategic updates. Your grandfather would say you learned to see the price but forgot the value," I observed. "He would," Blake agreed, a flash of genuine grief crossing his features. God, I miss him sometimes. He had such clarity about what mattered. Thunder cracked overhead, rain lashing against the windows as the storm intensified. The abrupt darkness prompted me to rise and switch on the Tiffany-style lamp Earl had rewired himself, its stained glass casting warm patterns similar to the transom's effect. The downtown development was going to be my masterpiece, Blake continued, as I settled back into my chair. Luxury condos in a converted warehouse. I leveraged everything for it, took on partners, promised returns I was confident I could deliver. When material costs skyrocketed last year, I started looking for additional capital and thought of the value this house could bring. I finished for him. He nodded, shame evident in his posture. I convinced myself it was practical, even compassionate. You were getting older. The house was too much to maintain. You'd be safer in a retirement community. But those were justifications, not my true motivation. This admission, the first honest acknowledgement of his underlying agenda, hung between us like a fragile thread, connecting present truth to past deception. I was desperate, he continued. The development was faltering. Investors were getting nervous, and I kept thinking about the potential $1 million just sitting in this property. By the time I suggested Whispering Pines, I was already calculating how your equity could save my project. Why tell me this now? I asked. The deed transfer is complete. The house is protected. There's nothing to gain from this confession. Blake's expression shifted from shame to something more complex. Regret tinged with dawning awareness. Because I finally realized what I've lost. Not the house as an asset, but what it represents. The connection to Grandpa, to you, to the values that shaped me before I let ambition override everything else. Rain continued to batter the windows, nature's percussion underscoring the gravity of the moment. This wasn't the Blake who had coldly assessed my outdated kitchen or calculated my remaining years against property values. This was the grandson I had feared was lost entirely, showing the first genuine signs of recognition regarding what truly mattered. The house was never going to be yours to sell, I said gently. Even if I hadn't transferred the deed, it was meant to be preserved, not liquidated. That was always Earl's and my intention. Blake nodded slowly. I know that now. I think I always knew it, actually, which makes my behavior even worse. I convinced myself that times had changed, that Grandpa would understand pragmatic decisions in today's market. But that was self-serving nonsense. This moment of honest self-assessment opened a door I had thought permanently closed. Not to forgiveness, perhaps. That would require more than a single rain-soaked confession. But to the possibility of understanding, of reconnection based on truth rather than manipulation. As the storm gradually subsided outside, leaving only the gentle patter of residual raindrops on the porch roof, Blake and I remained in the parlor, the silence between us no longer charged with hostility, but with the tentative possibility of reconciliation. I don't expect you to forgive me, Blake finally said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. What I did, trying to manipulate you out of your home, questioning your competence, even showing the property to potential buyers, was inexcusable. I studied my grandson carefully, looking for signs of the calculated charm he'd employed in previous conversations. Instead, I found only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. Forgiveness isn't a single moment, Blake, I replied carefully. It's a process that requires truth, accountability, and changed behavior. We've only just begun with truth. He nodded, accepting this assessment without protest. I'd like the chance to demonstrate the other parts, if you're willing. Outside, the clouds began to part, late afternoon sunlight breaking through to cast long shadows across the parlor floor. The sudden illumination highlighted the water stains on Blake's shirt, the untidy hair so unlike his usual polished appearance, the tension in his shoulders as he awaited my response. What exactly are you asking for? I questioned, needing clarity before making any commitments. Blake considered this, visibly choosing his words with care rather than falling back on practiced phrases. A chance to rebuild trust. Not to reclaim what I thought should be mine, but to reconnect with what actually matters. The values Grandpa tried to instill in me. The relationship with you I've damaged through my own actions. And if there's never any financial benefit from this reconnection? I pressed, testing the authenticity of his change of heart. If the house remains with the trust, if my remaining assets go primarily to preservation causes as I've planned, then I'll have gained something far more valuable than property, he replied simply. Something in his tone, a quality I hadn't heard since he was young, helping Earl carefully remove layers of paint from intricate woodwork, resonated with authenticity. Not complete transformation, perhaps, but the first genuine step toward reconnection with the person he had been before ambition overrode integrity. I can't promise the relationship will ever be what it once was, I said honestly. Trust, once broken, repairs slowly and often shows the cracks of its history. But I'm willing to begin the process if you are. Relief washed over his features. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. As Blake rose to leave, something caught his attention on the side table. Earl's pocket watch, the Hamilton that had belonged to his great-grandfather, which I had given Blake after Earl's funeral. He picked it up gently, turning it in his hands. I pawned this 6 months ago, he said quietly, shame evident in his voice. When cash flow problems started with the development. How did you get it back? I hadn't known the watch was missing until that moment, but I maintained my composure. I didn't. That's the duplicate Earl had commissioned when the original showed signs of wear. He kept both in working order, alternating between them to extend their longevity. Blake carefully returned the watch to its place. Preservation through thoughtful use. Another of his principles I forgot. Not forgot, I corrected gently. Set aside temporarily. There's a difference. After Blake left, I sat alone in the gathering twilight, processing the unexpected turn our relationship had taken. The breach wasn't healed. Too much had happened for instant restoration. But a pathway had opened that I hadn't thought possible. The following Sunday, Blake returned for dinner as we had once done regularly. He arrived punctually, carrying not wine or flowers, but a small, carefully wrapped package. We ate in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room. The conversation, tentative but genuine, focusing on neutral topics as we re-established basic connections. After dinner, as we moved to the porch to enjoy the cooler evening air, Blake handed me the package. I've been visiting pawn shops throughout the city, he explained as I unwrapped it. This was at the third one I tried. Inside lay Earl's original Hamilton pocket watch, its gold case showing the subtle patina of generations of handling. The key. Pawnbroker recognized its historic value and kept it in his private collection, rather than putting it up for sale, Blake continued. He was reluctant to part with it until I explained its significance to our family. I ran my thumb across the worn case, feeling the slight depression where Earl's fingers had pressed countless times to check the hour. You paid to redeem it? Blake nodded. It's not about the money. It's about recognizing what's truly valuable. This gesture, the effort to locate and reclaim a family heirloom he had sacrificed during financial desperation, spoke more eloquently than any verbal apology. It represented not just regret, but active restitution, a tangible demonstration of changing priorities. Over the following weeks, Blake's reintegration into my life proceeded gradually. He began by offering practical assistance, driving me to medical appointments, helping with grocery shopping during a particularly hot spell, assisting Michael with minor repairs around the house. Each interaction rebuilt small measures of trust, establishing new patterns of relationship based on respect rather than exploitation. During one such visit, Blake encountered Sophia organizing Earl's restoration journals in the study. His initial discomfort at finding someone else engaged with family documents was visible, but he listened with growing interest as she explained her thesis project and the preservation principles she was documenting. "My grandfather would have appreciated your thoroughness," he commented after reviewing her chapter on Earl's approach to historic window restoration. "He always said documentation was as important as the work itself." "Your grandmother has been incredibly generous with both materials and insights," Sophia replied, glancing at me with genuine appreciation. "This house and its restoration represent preservation ethics at their finest." Watching their interaction, Blake reconnecting with his grandfather's values through a stranger's scholarly appreciation, Sophia unwittingly helping bridge the gap between past principles and present understanding, I felt a surprising sense of completion. The legacy Earl and I had built was finding its future through multiple channels, some biological, some chosen, all authentic in their recognition of what truly mattered. As autumn approached, the trust began preparations for the slate roof restoration. Blake, showing genuine interest, asked River detailed questions about historical accuracy, material sourcing, and craftspeople's qualifications. His professional expertise, once focused solely on market value, now engaged with preservation standards, in ways that would have delighted Earl. "You know," River commented to me after one such conversation, "your grandson has valuable knowledge about contemporary building codes that could help us navigate some of the more challenging aspects of historic restoration. If he's interested, the Trust could use a consultant with both real estate expertise and appreciation for preservation principles." This suggestion, that Blake might find a way to integrate his professional skills with his grandfather's values, offered a potential path forward I hadn't considered. Not erasing the past breach, but transforming its lessons into something constructive and meaningful. On the morning of my 76th birthday, I woke to the gentle sounds of activity in my garden. Curious, I wrapped a light shawl around my shoulders and made my way downstairs to investigate. Through the kitchen window, I spotted Blake kneeling beside the heritage rose beds, carefully working the soil around the base of Earl's prized bourbon roses. I stepped onto the porch, coffee cup in hand, and watched silently as my grandson, dressed in work clothes rather than his usual business attire, methodically applied the mulching technique Earl had perfected for protecting these fragile historic varieties. "You remembered," I said finally, making my presence known. Blake looked up, a genuine smile warming his features. 3 inches of composted leaves, never piled against the stem, extended just beyond the drip line. He recited Earl's instructions, as if they'd been shared yesterday rather than decades ago. "Happy birthday, Grandma." "Thank you," I replied, settling into the porch chair to observe his work. "The roses are a lovely gift." "It's not just the roses," Blake said, rising and brushing soil from his knees. "I've been talking with the Trust about establishing a workshop series here, teaching homeowners traditional restoration techniques like the ones Grandpa developed. If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to help organize it. Put my project management skills to better use than luxury flips." The proposal represented everything I had hoped might emerge from our difficult journey. Not just reconciliation between us, but reconnection with the values that had shaped our family across generations. "Your grandfather would have loved that idea," I said softly. "Making this house not just preserved history, but living education." Blake nodded, understanding the significance of my response. "I've been rethinking a lot of things these past months. What success really means, what legacy is worth building." He gestured toward the house. "This place was never meant to be a financial asset for me. It was meant to be a touchstone, a reminder of principles worth honoring." As we shared breakfast in the kitchen afterward, the conversation flowed more naturally than it had in years. Blake spoke of his plans to refocus his real estate practice toward authentic historic preservation rather than luxury renovations. I shared updates about Sophia's thesis and the expanding educational programs the trust was developing around the house. Neither of us mentioned Whispering Pines or his earlier attempts to claim the property. Those chapters remained part of our story, but they no longer defined our relationship. Instead, we focused on the path forward, one built on mutual respect, shared values, and the recognition that Earl's true legacy resided not in property, but in principles. Later that afternoon, as friends gathered for a small birthday celebration in the garden, I watched Blake explaining to Sophia the proper technique for cleaning century-old brick without damaging its patina. Their animated discussion, focused entirely on preservation rather than profit, embodied the transformation that had taken place not just in my grandson, but in my understanding of legacy itself. The house Earl and I had saved would never belong to Blake in the way he had once envisioned. Instead, it had become something far more meaningful, a vessel for transmitting values across generations, a bridge between past craftsmanship and future stewardship, a testament to the principle that some things are worth preserving precisely because they cannot be reduced to market value. As twilight softened the garden edges and conversation flowed around me, I realized that my greatest victory hadn't been outsmarting Blake's schemes or protecting the house through legal means. It had been holding firm to principles until their inherent worth became visible again to the grandson who had temporarily lost sight of them. Some lessons, it seems, must be learned through loss before their value can be truly understood. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.